Picture a quiet Saturday evening in late January. Families cozying up by the fire, children tucked safely in bed, the radio humming softly in the background. A seemingly ordinary winter night along Britain's east coast. Yet, far out over the North Sea, a storm was quietly gathering strength, one so ferocious that by morning it would claim more than 300 British lives, submerge entire towns under icy water, and go down as the deadliest natural disaster Britain experienced in the 20th century. The night of January 31st, 1953, a date that still sends shivers down the spines of anyone who remembers it. This wasn't merely flooding. This was the sea rising up to swallow everything and everyone in its path. And post-war Britain, still weary and piecing itself together, was completely unprepared. The storm began almost silently. On Friday, January 30th, the Meteorological Office had issued alerts about a severe system forming over the North Sea, deep low pressure, strengthening winds, spring tides approaching. Such warnings weren't unusual, and most people carried on as normal. Pubs were busy, chip shops bustling, families gathered around the fire listening to the wireless. Few imagined the catastrophe heading their way. The first gusts struck Scotland. Wind speeds reached a record 126 mph at Costa Hill in the Orkney Islands. Trees snapped in half, roofs were torn from houses, and the Princess Victoria Ferry, en route from Stranraer to Northern Ireland, battled the storm with all hands on deck. By 2 p.m., the captain was forced to give the order to abandon ship. Of the 179 people aboard, 133 would not survive, the first victims of a storm that was only just beginning along the North Sea. The surge, built as hurricane-force winds, pushed seawater south, combining with spring tides and low pressure to lift the sea over 18 feet above normal in some areas. A wall of water raced toward Britain's east coast, faster than anyone could escape. And most people, sleeping peacefully, had no warning. Television was rare. Radios had gone off for the night, and telephone lines were about to be destroyed by the very storm meant to alert people. In towns like Canvey Island in Essex, police tried desperately to warn residents. By the time sirens sounded, it was too late for many. Around midnight, the water struck, first Lincolnshire, then Norfolk, followed by Suffolk and Essex. Seawalls that had stood for decades gave way, with over 1,200 breaches pouring millions of gallons of freezing seawater onto sleeping communities. In Mablethorpe, waves surged 3 meters inland. Hunstanton's seawall collapsed, flooding homes chest-deep before residents could react. Canvey Island suffered the worst, a low-lying settlement in the Thames estuary, home to about 11,000, most in small bungalows and wartime prefabs. When the seawall at Small Gaines Creek gave way shortly after midnight, water rushed across the island faster than anyone could respond. Entire streets vanished beneath 6 feet of icy water. 5-year-old children drowned in their beds. Elderly couples trapped upstairs watched helplessly as the flood rose. Prefabricated houses, never meant to endure such force, either floated away or crumpled entirely. 58 people died on Canvey Island that night, parents, children, grandparents, gone before dawn. Further down the coast, tragedy struck Jaywick, a small village of wooden chalets and holiday homes turned permanent residences, built right on the shoreline. Floodwaters swept across the marshes behind the village, trapping residents between 2 walls of water. 37 people died, around 5% of the village's population. Families were wiped out entirely, and some bodies weren't recovered for days, drifting out to sea. In Harwich, Elsie Lofts huddled in the cellar of the Anchor Hotel with her husband when the sea struck. A deafening roar unlike anything she'd ever heard. Then the outer door burst inward. A torrent hit with the force of a train, lifting her up the stairs without touching a single step. Behind her, the door slammed shut, trapping her husband below. She screamed into the dark, but the water kept rising. On Foulness Island in the Thames estuary, residents awoke to find their world transformed into an ocean. By Sunday morning, a light aircraft flying overhead reported back a chilling message: no signs of life. The island had been almost entirely submerged. Most clung to rooftops and attics, freezing but alive. Sadly, not everyone survived. 2 women and a War Department policeman drowned, their bodies recovered days later. At Felixstowe in Suffolk, 41 people perished when prefabs in the West End flooded. In Harwich, 8 more drowned, some trapped in cellar flats as water smashed through doors and windows. Along the coast, the same nightmare repeated, families awakened by terror, scrambling for safety, many never reaching it. Even those who survived the initial surge faced deadly consequences. January nights in Britain are bitterly cold. Soaked through, standing on rooftops or clinging to trees amid howling winds, hypothermia claimed many lives before rescue could reach them. Yet in the midst of darkness, ordinary people performed extraordinary acts. Police waded chest-deep through freezing waters, carrying children and elderly to safety. Firemen launched boats down flooded streets, breaking windows to rescue trapped families. On Canvey Island, a local fireman defied orders and sounded the air raid siren, saving hundreds from drowning. Neighbors formed human chains, passing children hand to hand to higher ground. Strangers opened homes to provide blankets, dry clothing, and tea. In Lincolnshire, officers Charles Lewis and Leonard Deepford spent the night pulling victims from the water. Lewis jumped from an upper window to save an elderly couple being swept away, continuing tirelessly until he located a working phone to call for help. Both men were later awarded George medals for bravery. By dawn, the full scale of the disaster was clear. Towns submerged, bodies floating in streets, thousands homeless, standing with whatever they had managed to grab, watching their lives wash away. Canvey Island resembled a lake, only rooftops visible. Jaywick had disappeared as a village. The government launched the largest peacetime rescue operation Britain had ever seen, Operation King Canute. By February 12th, 30,000 emergency personnel were involved. The RAF flew reconnaissance missions, capturing over 20,000 photographs to assess the destruction. Army lorries rolled through flooded streets, soldiers calling out for survivors. Boats navigated between homes, checking for anyone left behind. Over 30,000 people were evacuated along the east coast, many with nowhere to go. Village halls, schools, and churches became temporary shelters. Families huddled under army blankets, sipping soup from field kitchens, trying to comprehend the devastation. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret visited survivors, offering solace, though words could never undo such loss. The death toll was staggering. In England, 307 people died, 19 more in Scotland. Across the North Sea in the Netherlands, flooding claimed 1,836 lives, while 230 people drowned at sea, mostly fishermen and small craft crews. Over 2,400 souls were lost in a single night, but numbers fail to capture the human tragedy. Peggy Morgan from Canvey Island lost her husband, mother-in-law, and 5-year-old son in the flood. She survived by clinging to furniture, watching helplessly as her family was swept away. A grief echoed hundreds of times across the coast. The damage extended beyond lives lost. Over 24,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. 160,000 acres of farmland flooded with seawater, unusable for years. Thousands of livestock drowned. Roads, railways, and power stations were knocked out. The 1953 cost, £50 million, over £1 billion today. Some communities never fully recovered. Questions arose immediately. Why weren't people warned? Why did seawalls fail? Why were so many living in flimsy coastal housing? The answers were sobering. Post-war Britain was still poor. Prefabs, meant as temporary solutions after the Blitz, were still occupied 8 years later. Sea defenses, damaged in the war, had never been repaired. A proper warning system didn't exist. Lessons were learned. The Met Office gained responsibility for flood forecasting. Seawalls were rebuilt stronger. Housing regulations prevented construction in the most vulnerable areas. Plans began for the Thames Barrier, a massive engineering project to shield London from future surges. Though completed only in 1982, it still protects the city today. In the Netherlands, hit even harder, the Delta Works were launched. One of the most ambitious flood defense projects ever, with dams, barriers, and storm surge protections designed to prevent a repeat of the 1953 disaster. Both nations vowed never again. 70 years later, the 1953 flood remains Britain's worst natural disaster of the 20th century. Survivors still recall the sound of crashing water, the bone-chilling cold, and the eerie silence afterward. The defenses built in its wake were tested in 2013, exactly 60 years later, when another surge hit the East Coast. This time, the barriers held, and no lives were lost. The lessons of 1953, paid for in blood, had worked. If you remember that night, or have family who lived through it, share their story. All we can do is remember the lost, honor the heroes, and make sure it never happens again.